Billionaire buried pregnant wife, alive for mistress. Her escape shocked the world. Disclaimer. This story is inspired by true events and real survival cases, including documented instances of people who escaped being buried alive. While dramatized for narrative purposes, it draws from actual criminal cases and psychological profiles of financial abuse and intimate partner violence. What if your perfect marriage was actually a death trap waiting to spring Elena Harrington? 42 would soon discover that this nightmare scenario was about to become her reality. The morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Manhattan penthouse like a golden blade, illuminating what Elena had believed was her perfect world. At 6 months pregnant with her first child, she should have been glowing with happiness. Instead, she found herself studying her husband's credit card statement with the sharp focus that had once made her a Pulitzer-nominated investigative journalist. Cartier, $15,000. Le Bernardin, $500. The Plaza Hotel, $800. All on dates when Victor had claimed to be in boring business meetings. Elena's hand instinctively moved to protect her growing belly as the pieces of a devastating puzzle began forming in her mind. After 5 years of marriage to billionaire tech mogul Victor Harrington, she was discovering that the man she trusted with her life might actually be planning to take it. The irony wasn't lost on her that at an age when many women feared their childbearing years were behind them, Elena was not only experiencing the miracle of pregnancy, but also uncovering what might be the story of her lifetime, and possibly her death. Victor Harrington had built his empire on digital banking technology, revolutionizing how people manage their money. But as Elena stared at the evidence of his deception, she wondered if he'd been managing her life with the same cold calculation he applied to his business deals. Their love story had been the stuff of Manhattan fairy tales. Elena, the fearless journalist who'd exposed corruption at the highest levels of city government, meets Victor, the tech visionary who'd become a billionaire before his 40th birthday. She'd been interviewing him for a piece on corporate philanthropy when their professional meeting had transformed into something neither had expected. "You're not what I imagined," Victor had said during that first interview, his piercing blue eyes studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "What did you imagine?" Elena had challenged, her journalistic instincts on high alert even as she felt drawn to his charisma. "Someone harder, more cynical. You still believe in justice, don't you?" That question haunted Elena now as she realized she might need that belief in justice more than ever. Victor had pursued her with the single-minded determination that had made him successful in business. Expensive gifts, exotic trips, and eventually a proposal in Iceland under the northern lights that had left her breathless with what she'd thought was love. But love doesn't leave mysterious charges on credit cards. Love doesn't make whispered phone calls at midnight. And love certainly doesn't make a pregnant woman feel like she's living with a stranger. Elena opened her laptop and began typing the words that would soon prove prophetic. Billionaire buried pregnant wife alive for mistress. Her escape shocked the world. She was crafting what she thought was a hypothetical headline for a crime story, not realizing she was writing her own future. The baby kicked inside her, as if sensing her distress, and Elena whispered, "Don't worry, little one. Mommy's going to figure out what's happening here. Daddy better not be doing what I think he's doing." Elena's journalistic training had taught her that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most trustworthy. Corporate fraud, political corruption, intimate partner violence, they all shared common elements of manipulation, control, and the gradual erosion of the victim's ability to recognize the danger they were in. As Elena began her investigation into her own husband, she couldn't know that she was following in the footsteps of other women who had uncovered similar conspiracies. Women like Michalina Lewandowska, who had famously escaped after being buried alive by an abusive partner, or the countless unnamed victims whose stories never made headlines because they hadn't been lucky enough to survive. But Elena's story would be different. Her escape would indeed shock the world, though not in the way anyone could predict. The sound of the elevator arriving jolted Elena from her research. Victor was home, and she would have to perform the role of the unsuspecting wife while gathering evidence that might save her life. She quickly closed her laptop and arranged her face into the smile she'd perfected over months of growing suspicion. Elena. Victor's voice carried through the apartment, and she noted the slight strain in it that she'd been hearing more frequently lately. In the kitchen, she called back, checking her reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator. Even at 6 months pregnant, she was still the woman who'd caught a billionaire's attention, though she was beginning to suspect that attention had become something far more sinister than love. Victor appeared in the doorway, impeccably dressed despite the early hour. At 45, he was more distinguished than ever, but something in his expression made Elena's maternal instincts flare with protective alarm. "You're up early," he said, kissing her cheek with what felt like practiced affection rather than genuine warmth. "The baby's active this morning," Elena replied, hoping to see some spark of paternal interest in his eyes. "I think he or she is going to be an early riser like their mother." Victor nodded absently, already reaching for his phone. As Elena watched him prioritize his device over his pregnant wife and unborn child, she made a decision that would change everything. She was going to investigate Victor Harrington with the same thoroughness she'd once applied to corrupt politicians and corporate criminals. What Elena discovered would prove that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one sharing your bed, and that love can be the perfect camouflage for murder. The billionaire's pregnant wife was about to become a detective in the most important case of her life, one where failure wouldn't just mean losing a story, but losing everything. Would you confront your spouse immediately upon discovering evidence of betrayal? Or would you gather more proof first? Elena chose the path of the seasoned investigative journalist. She documented everything and planned her confrontation carefully. Over the next 3 days, Elena's investigation revealed a pattern of deception that chilled her to the bone. Using the same methodical approach that had once earned her a Pulitzer nomination, she photographed credit card statements, documented Victor's suspicious phone calls, and traced his movements through social media and public records. What she discovered was worse than a simple affair. Elena found herself researching Sophia Lang, the 28-year-old lifestyle influencer whose Instagram account told the story of Elena's marriage in reverse. There was Sophia wearing jewelry that Elena recognized from their credit card statements. Sophia dining at restaurants where Victor claimed to have business meetings. Sophia traveling to destinations that Elena had thought were Victor's solo business trips. But it was the timing that made Elena's blood run cold. Sophia's post showed a relationship that had been going on for over a year, long before Elena had announced her pregnancy. This wasn't a man having a midlife crisis. This was a man who had been systematically deceiving his wife while she carried his child. The real breakthrough came when Elena's former colleague, Detective Maria Santos, returned her call. Maria had worked with Elena on several expose pieces involving domestic violence and financial crimes. "Elena, you sound scared," Maria said after they'd arranged to meet at a coffee shop in Queens, far from their usual Manhattan haunts. "I think my husband is planning to kill me," Elena said quietly, the words feeling surreal even as she spoke them. Elena laid out her evidence, the affair, the suspicious expenditures, and most damning of all, the life insurance policies worth $50 million that Victor had taken out on her life just months after she'd announced her pregnancy. "Elena, this fits a pattern I've seen before," Maria said, her expression growing grave. "Wealthy men who see their wives as obstacles to their affairs sometimes resort to murder rather than divorce because they want to keep their assets and avoid scandal." That afternoon, Elena made a discovery that transformed her fear into terror. Hidden in Victor's home office, behind some old tax documents, she found a folder containing contact information for a private investigator, a medical examiner, and most chilling of all, detailed maps of remote locations in upstate New York. But it was the handwritten notes that made Elena's hands shake as she photographed them. Insurance requires autopsy. Pregnancy complications believable at her age. Location must be isolated. No cell service. Timeline after baby shower. Elena will be emotional, vulnerable. Elena realized that Victor wasn't just planning to kill her. He was planning to make it look like she died from pregnancy complications, and he had identified the perfect location to stage her death. That evening, Elena overheard a phone conversation that confirmed her worst fears. Victor was in his study, speaking in low tones that he probably thought couldn't be heard from the hallway. "The cabin is perfect," Victor was saying. "No neighbors for miles, no cell service. We can stage the accident there, and I'll call for help hours later. By the time anyone arrives, it'll be too late." Elena pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear every word. "Sophia, I know this is difficult, but think about the 50 million. We can disappear anywhere in the world with that kind of money." Elena bit her lip to keep from gasping aloud. Victor wasn't just discussing her murder. He was discussing it with his mistress as if they were planning a vacation. "No, Elena doesn't suspect anything," Victor continued. "She's been completely focused on the pregnancy preparations. It's actually working in our favor. She's more isolated than ever from her old journalist contacts." As Elena listened to her husband and his mistress plan her death, she felt a rage she'd never experienced before. But underneath the rage was something even more powerful, the fierce protective instinct of a mother who would do anything to save her child. Elena spent the next several hours in what she would later describe as a controlled panic. She needed to gather more evidence, but she also needed to protect herself and her baby. Using encrypted messaging apps and techniques she'd learned during her investigative journalism career, Elena began building a case that would not only save her life, but also ensure that Victor and Sophia faced justice for their crimes. She copied financial records, photographed the damning documents in Victor's office, and used a small recording device to capture any future conversations about the murder plot. Most importantly, Elena reached out to the FBI, using her journalist credentials to get a meeting with Agent Jennifer Park, who specialized in interstate conspiracy cases. "Mrs. Harrington, what you're describing is conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud," Agent Park said after reviewing Elena's evidence. "But we need more than circumstantial evidence to make arrests." "What if I could get them to confess on tape?" Elena asked. "That would be extremely dangerous. We're talking about people who are planning to kill you." "They're already planning to kill me," Elena replied. "At least this way, if something happens to me, there will be evidence to convict them." Elena realized that her journalism background had prepared her for this moment in ways she never could have anticipated. She knew how to gather evidence, how to protect sources, and how to build airtight cases against powerful people who thought they were above the law. But she also knew that Victor and Sophia had resources and connections that made them extremely dangerous. They had planned her murder with the same attention to detail that Victor applied to his business deals, and Elena would need to be equally strategic if she wanted to survive. As Elena lay in bed that night, listening to Victor's steady breathing beside her, she whispered to her unborn child, "Mommy's going to make sure Daddy can never hurt us. But first, we need to get through what's coming next." Elena didn't know exactly when Victor would spring his trap, but she knew it would be soon. The baby was due in 3 months, and Victor's plan seemed timed to her most vulnerable period. Elena had 3 months to build a case that would not only save her life, but also ensure that her child would grow up free from the threat of a father who was capable of murder. The pregnant wife who had stumbled onto a conspiracy was about to become the investigator who would expose it. And when the truth finally came out, it would indeed shock the world. What drives someone to push for the murder of an innocent pregnant woman, Elena, was about to discover that jealousy and greed could create monsters out of ordinary people. While Elena was uncovering the plot against her life, Sophia Lang was busy perfecting it. In her Tribeca penthouse, a mirror image of Elena's home that Victor had furnished with identical expensive taste, Sophia was consumed by a jealousy that had metastasized into something deadly. At 28, Sophia had built her career on her appearance and her ability to manipulate wealthy men. Her Instagram account, with its carefully curated images of luxury and beauty, was really a hunting ground where she identified and pursued targets. Victor Harrington had been her biggest catch, but Elena's pregnancy threatened to destroy everything Sophia had worked for. "Victor, you need to stop being weak about this," Sophia hissed into her phone as she paced her living room, her heels clicking angrily on the marble floors. "Every day you wait is another day she could discover what we're planning." Victor's voice came through the speaker, strained and uncertain. Sophia, killing someone isn't like a business transaction. Elena is the mother of my child. A child that will tie you to her forever, Sophia snapped. Do you want to pay alimony and child support for the next 18 years? Or do you want to collect $50 million and start fresh with me? Sophia had studied Victor's psychology with the precision of a predator. She knew that his businessman's mind would eventually see the murder as a cost-benefit analysis. $50 million in insurance money versus decades of financial obligations to Elena and their child. To someone like Victor, the choice was obvious. I've already contacted Dr. Morrison at the medical examiner's office, Sophia continued. He's agreed to sign off on pregnancy complications as the cause of death. With Elena's age and the stress of carrying her first child, it will be completely believable. Sophia had met Dr. Morrison through her previous relationship with a pharmaceutical executive who had died in what was ruled an accidental overdose. Dr. Morrison had been helpful then, and his gambling debts made him equally cooperative now. The cabin you bought is perfect, Sophia said, switching to a more seductive tone. Remote, no cell service, no witnesses. We can stage it to look like she fell and hit her head while you were out gathering firewood. You'll be devastated, of course. The grieving widower who lost his beloved wife and unborn child. Sophia had researched similar cases, studying how other seemingly loving spouses had successfully murdered their partners for insurance money. The key was to create a plausible accident in a location where no one could immediately provide medical assistance. What about her investigation background? Victor asked. Elena's been asking questions about my travel schedule. She's suspicious. Sophia felt a flicker of concern, but quickly dismissed it. She's 6 months pregnant and hormonal. Even if she suspects you're having an affair, she's not going to imagine that you're planning to kill her. Women like Elena think their husbands are capable of betrayal, not murder. Sophia was wrong about Elena's capabilities, but her confidence was unshakable. She had seduced men away from their wives before, and she had always emerged victorious. Elena was just another obstacle to be removed. Besides, Sophia continued, once she's dead, it won't matter what she suspected. Dead women can't testify against their husbands. Sophia had already begun planning how she and Victor would spend the insurance money. A house in Switzerland, perhaps, or a yacht where they could travel the world. Victor's business was portable. He could run his tech empire from anywhere. They would be wealthy, free, and untouchable. Sophia, sometimes I wonder if you actually care about me, or if you just see me as a meal ticket, Victor said quietly. Sophia's expression hardened. She had worked too hard to let Victor develop a conscience now. Darling, I love you enough to help you solve your problems, she said sweetly. Elena is a problem. Your unborn child is a problem. Your business debts are a problem. I'm offering you a solution that eliminates all three problems at once. Victor's business debts were another factor that Sophia had been exploiting. Victor's tech empire was profitable but highly leveraged, and he had made some risky investments that were threatening his cash flow. Elena's $50 million life insurance policy would solve his financial problems while also freeing him to be with Sophia. I've already transferred some money to our Swiss account, Sophia lied smoothly. Once this is over, we can disappear and start our new life together. In reality, Sophia had been moving money to accounts that only she controlled. She had no intention of sharing the insurance money equally with Victor. Men were useful for their resources and their access. But Sophia had learned long ago that true security came from controlling wealth herself. Sophia ended the call and walked to her window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline that she planned to leave behind once Elena was dead. She felt no guilt about the pregnant woman she was helping to murder. In Sophia's worldview, women like Elena were weak and naive, relying on their husbands for financial security instead of taking control of their own lives. If Elena was smart, she would have taken half of Victor's money in a divorce, Sophia murmured to herself. Instead, she's going to lose everything. Sophia didn't know that Elena was far from naive, and that the journalist's investigation skills were already uncovering the plot against her. The mistress who thought she was orchestrating the perfect crime was actually helping to build the case that would eventually destroy her. But for now, Sophia felt confident and in control. She had Victor wrapped around her finger, a corrupt medical examiner ready to falsify records, and a plan that seemed foolproof. In her mind, Elena was already dead. The only question remaining was when Victor would find the courage to pull the trigger. Sophia picked up her phone and sent Victor a text that she hoped would accelerate his timeline. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes. Elena needs to have her accident soon. What Sophia didn't know was that Elena had already planted surveillance equipment in Victor's car and was monitoring his text messages. Every word of Sophia's manipulation was being recorded, building the case that would eventually bring both conspirators to justice. The mistress who thought she was directing a murder plot was actually performing for an audience that would ensure her destruction. Elena was not the weak, naive victim that Sophia imagined, but a determined mother who would fight to the death to protect her child. The confrontation between these two women was inevitable, and when it came, Sophia would discover that underestimating Elena had been her fatal mistake. Have you ever felt the moment when fear transforms into determination? For Elena, that transformation came when she discovered the full scope of Victor and Sophia's plan to murder her and steal her life insurance money. Elena's investigation had reached a critical juncture. She had evidence of the affair, the insurance policies, and the overheard conversations about her planned murder. But Agent Park was right. She needed more concrete evidence if she wanted to ensure that Victor and Sophia would be convicted of their crimes. Using property records and cross-referencing Victor's recent financial transactions, Elena discovered that her husband had purchased a remote cabin in the Adirondack Mountains under the name of a shell company. The property was 127 acres of complete isolation, accessible only by a single dirt road, and located in an area with no cell phone coverage. Elena studied satellite images of the property and felt her blood run cold. This wasn't a romantic getaway destination. It was the perfect place to murder someone and dispose of their body. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, and the area was so remote that it could be weeks before anyone discovered a missing person. But Elena's investigation revealed something even more disturbing. Victor and Sophia weren't planning to kill her quickly. According to the notes she'd found in Victor's office, they were planning to bury her alive and let her suffocate slowly in a shallow grave. Elena found research on Victor's computer about how long someone could survive underground in various soil conditions. He had even calculated air supply based on the depth of the grave and Elena's lung capacity. The medical precision of his planning revealed a level of calculation that made Elena realize she was dealing with a true psychopath. "They want me to suffer," Elena whispered to her unborn child as she documented the evidence. "But Mommy's not going to let that happen to us." Elena's research into similar cases revealed that burial alive was often used by killers who wanted their victims to experience maximum terror before death. It was a method that suggested not just greed, but genuine sadistic pleasure in causing suffering. But Elena also discovered something that gave her hope people had survived being buried alive before. She found historical accounts and recent news stories of individuals who had clawed their way out of graves, including a woman named Michalina Lewandowska, who had been buried by an abusive partner and had successfully escaped. Elena began studying these survival stories with the intensity of someone whose life depended on the knowledge. She learned about air pockets, soil composition, and the physical techniques needed to dig upward through earth. She even practiced breathing exercises that could help preserve oxygen in a confined space. "If they bury me alive, I'm going to get out," Elena told herself. "And when I do, I'm going to make sure they pay for what they tried to do to us." Elena's first moment of peak despair came when she realized the full extent of her isolation. Victor had been systematically cutting her off from her support network, discouraging her friendships and professional relationships under the guise of protecting her during her pregnancy. Elena tried calling her sister Maria, only to discover that Victor had been intercepting her calls and telling her family that Elena needed space during this difficult time. When Elena finally reached Maria on a secure line, she learned that her family had been worried about her, but had been told by Victor that Elena was experiencing pregnancy-related depression and didn't want visitors. "Elena, we've been so worried," Maria said. "Victor told us you were having a difficult pregnancy and needed complete rest. He said you didn't want to see anyone until after the baby was born." Elena realized that Victor had been isolating her for months, creating the perfect conditions for her disappearance. If she vanished, everyone would assume she had suffered some kind of pregnancy-related crisis, and Victor would be seen as the devoted husband who had tried to protect her privacy. The isolation was part of a larger pattern of psychological manipulation that Elena recognized from her reporting on domestic violence cases. Victor had been gradually eroding her confidence, her independence, and her connections to the outside world. He had convinced her that her hormonal state was making her paranoid and oversensitive, discouraging her from trusting her own instincts. But Elena's journalistic training had prepared her to recognize and resist psychological manipulation. She began documenting not just the murder plot, but the months of subtle abuse that had preceded it. Elena created detailed timelines of Victor's behavior, noting how he had gradually taken control of their social calendar, their finances, and even her medical care. She realized that Victor had been positioning himself as her sole source of information and support, making it easier to control her perceptions and reactions. "He's been grooming me for murder," Elena realized with crystal clarity. "This isn't just about the insurance money. He's been psychologically preparing me to be his victim." Elena contacted Dr. Lisa Chen, a trauma psychiatrist who had been a source for her stories about domestic violence. Dr. Chen agreed to meet with Elena secretly and help her understand the psychological dimensions of what she was experiencing. "Elena, what you're describing is intimate partner terrorism," Dr. Chen explained. "Your husband has been using systematic psychological warfare to break down your resistance and make you more vulnerable to his ultimate plan." Dr. Chen helped Elena understand that her feelings of confusion and self-doubt were normal responses to psychological manipulation, and that recognizing the abuse was the first step in resisting it. "The fact that you're fighting back instead of surrendering to helplessness shows incredible strength," Dr. Chen told her. "Your child is lucky to have a mother who refuses to be a victim." Elena left that meeting feeling more determined than ever to expose Victor and Sophia's plot. She wasn't just fighting for her own life. She was fighting for her child's future and for every other woman who might become Victor's victim if he succeeded in getting away with murder. Elena began preparing for what she knew would be the most dangerous investigation of her career. She purchased surveillance equipment, created encrypted backup copies of all her evidence, and established secure communication channels with Agent Park and Detective Santos. Most importantly, Elena wrote detailed instructions for what should happen if she disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. She created a dead man switch, a system that would automatically release all her evidence to law enforcement and the media if she failed to check in at regular intervals. "If Victor kills me, he's not going to get away with it," Elena said as she sealed the evidence packets and gave them to her attorney for safekeeping. "My death will destroy him." Elena also began physical preparations for survival. She studied combat techniques, learned about wilderness survival, and even practiced digging through different types of soil. If Victor and Sophia succeeded in burying her alive, Elena was determined to fight her way back to the surface. But Elena's most important preparation was psychological. She spent hours talking to her unborn child, explaining what was happening and promising that she would do everything in her power to protect them both. "Your father has forgotten what love really means," Elena whispered to her baby. "But Mommy will never forget, and that's going to make all the difference." Elena was ready for whatever Victor and Sophia had planned. She had evidence, allies, and most importantly, the fierce determination of a mother who would never stop fighting for her child's life. The billionaire and his mistress thought they were hunting a helpless victim. They were about to discover that they had chosen to hunt a predator instead. When your husband suggests a romantic weekend getaway, it should be a cause for celebration. For Elena, it was the signal that her execution had been scheduled. Victor came home on a Friday evening with champagne and roses. wearing the expression of a man who was about to make his wife very happy. Elena, who now understood the psychology behind his performances, recognized the gesture as the opening scene of her planned murder. "Darling, I've been thinking about what you said about us needing more time together before the baby arrives," Victor said, setting the champagne bottle on their kitchen counter with theatrical flourish. Elena forced her face into an expression of pleasant surprise, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Oh, I think we should get away for a long weekend. Just the two of us. Somewhere peaceful where we can really reconnect before we become parents." Every word Victor spoke confirmed Elena's worst fears. This was it, the invitation to her own execution. But Elena was ready for this moment. She was wearing a recording device, and she had already notified Agent Park and Detective Santos about the likely timeline for Victor's plan. "That sounds wonderful," Elena said, moving closer to Victor and placing her hand on his chest in a gesture that she hoped would seem affectionate while positioning her recording device to capture his words clearly. "Where were you thinking? I've found the perfect place. A cabin upstate, completely private, no phones, no business calls, just us and nature." Victor's smile was perfect, practiced, and completely terrifying to Elena, who now knew what he was really planning. Elena felt a flutter of movement from her baby, as if her child was responding to the stress hormones flooding her system. She placed her hand protectively over her belly and forced herself to smile. "When would we go?" Elena asked, though she was already calculating how many hours she had left to live. "This weekend. I know it's short notice, but I've cleared my schedule completely. No business, no interruptions. Just you, me, and our baby." The way Victor said "our baby" made Elena's skin crawl. He was planning to kill them both, yet he could speak about their child with such apparent tenderness. Elena realized she was looking at a level of psychological compartmentalization that allowed Victor to play the role of loving husband and father, even while planning a double murder. "That sounds perfect," Elena lied, leaning into Victor's embrace while her mind raced through the survival strategies she had been studying. "I'll start packing." "Don't pack too much," Victor said, kissing Elena's forehead in a gesture that would have seemed loving to any observer who didn't know his true intentions. "It's very rustic up there. Just basic necessities." Elena understood the subtext. Victor didn't want her to pack much because he wasn't expecting her to need a return trip. He was planning for her belongings to become evidence in her disappearance, items that would support his story of a tragic accident during their romantic getaway. After Victor left for work the next morning, Elena immediately contacted Agent Park using their secure communication channel. "He's accelerating the timeline," Elena said when they met at a diner in Brooklyn. "The cabin trip is this weekend." Agent Park's expression was grim. "Elena, we've been monitoring Victor's communications, and we believe he's moved up his plan because he suspects you might be onto him. That makes this even more dangerous." "What did you find?" Elena asked. "Sophia sent him a text yesterday saying, 'The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes. We think they're worried that you might discover their plot if they wait much longer.'" Elena felt a chill as she realized that her investigation might have inadvertently put her in greater danger by making Victor nervous about the timeline. "We can arrest them now based on the evidence you've gathered," Agent Park continued. "The conspiracy charges alone would put them away for decades." "No," Elena said firmly. "If we arrest them now, they'll claim the conversations were taken out of context, that the insurance policies were just good financial planning. We need them to actually attempt the murder, or they'll walk away with nothing more than slaps on the wrist." "Elena, you're 6 months pregnant. The risk to you and your baby—" "The risk is greater if we don't see this through," Elena interrupted. "If Victor suspects I know about his plan, he'll find another way to kill me. At least this way. I know when and where he's going to try, and I can be prepared." Elena outlined her survival plan with the methodical precision that had made her one of the country's best investigative journalists. She would wear multiple recording devices to document everything Victor said and did. Agent Park would position FBI units strategically around the property, close enough to intervene, but far enough away to avoid detection. Elena would also carry a GPS tracker that would allow law enforcement to monitor her location at all times. The moment he makes an actual attempt on your life, we move in, Agent Park said. But Elena, you have to promise me that you won't try to be a hero. The second you feel like you're in immediate danger, you activate the emergency beacon. Elena nodded, though privately she wondered if she would have the chance to activate anything if Victor's plan succeeded. She spent the remainder of the day making final preparations with the thoroughness of a soldier preparing for battle. Elena visited her doctor for what she claimed was a routine checkup, but was actually a way to document the perfect health of both herself and her baby. Any medical examiner who later claimed she had died from pregnancy complications would have to explain how a perfectly healthy pregnancy had suddenly become fatal. Elena also recorded a detailed video statement describing everything she had discovered about Victor's plan, with instructions that it should be released to the media if she died under suspicious circumstances. She wanted to ensure that even if Victor succeeded in killing her, his crime would be exposed and prosecuted. Most importantly, Elena wrote a letter to her unborn child, pouring out all the love and hopes she might not live to express in person. My dearest baby, if you're reading this, it means something terrible has happened to Mommy. But I want you to know that everything I did was to protect you and to make sure that the person who hurt us faced justice. You are loved beyond measure, and I hope that someday you'll understand that your mother was a fighter who never gave up. Elena sealed the letter and left it with her attorney, along with instructions for her funeral and a trust fund that would ensure her child was provided for regardless of what happened to the insurance money. The night before their trip to the cabin, Victor was unusually attentive, bringing Elena dinner in bed and talking about their future together with what seemed like genuine emotion. Elena recognized the behavior as a classic manipulation tactic, building emotional intimacy before committing an act of ultimate betrayal. I can't wait to see you as a mother, Victor said, his hand resting on Elena's belly while his eyes remained cold and calculating. You're going to be incredible. Elena studied her husband's face as he spoke those words, looking for any sign of the conscience that she hoped still existed somewhere inside him. But Victor's performance was flawless, his mask of loving devotion perfect even as he planned to murder his pregnant wife within hours. I love you, Victor, Elena said, and meant it. Despite everything she had discovered, part of her still loved the man she had married, even as she prepared to fight for her life against the monster he had become. I love you too, Victor replied, and Elena wondered if any part of him meant it, or if the capacity for genuine love had been completely consumed by his greed and narcissism. That night, Elena lay awake listening to Victor's steady breathing and thinking about the twisted psychology that allowed someone to plan a murder while lying next to their intended victim. She wondered how long Victor had been capable of this level of deception, and whether any of their relationship had been real. As dawn approached, Elena whispered final promises to her unborn child. Today is going to be scary, little one, but Mommy has a plan. We're going to survive this, and we're going to make sure Daddy can never hurt anyone else the way he's planning to hurt us. Elena rose and began her final preparations for what would either be the most successful investigation of her career or the last day of her life. The billionaire who planned to bury his pregnant wife alive for his mistress was about to discover that his intended victim was actually a formidable opponent who would fight to the death to protect her child. The stage was set for a confrontation that would indeed shock the world, though not in the way Victor expected. Elena was ready to turn his carefully planned trap into his ultimate downfall. Can you imagine what it feels like to wake up buried alive? Elena was about to discover that this nightmare scenario was even worse when the person who put you there was supposed to love you more than life itself. The drive to the cabin took 3 hours through increasingly remote countryside, each mile taking Elena further from help and deeper into the trap Victor had so carefully constructed. Elena sat in the passenger seat of Victor's Mercedes, one hand resting protectively on her belly and the other discreetly checking the recording devices hidden in her clothing. Victor was in an unusually good mood, chatting about the scenery and pointing out landmarks as if they were heading to a second honeymoon rather than Elena's planned execution. His performance was so convincing that if Elena hadn't seen the evidence herself, she might have believed that this was simply a loving husband trying to reconnect with his pregnant wife. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was exactly as remote as Elena had feared. It sat in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, accessible only by the narrow dirt road they had just traveled. There were no neighbors visible, no cell phone towers, and no signs of civilization beyond the rustic structure that Victor had chosen as Elena's tomb. "It's beautiful," Elena said, and she meant it. Under different circumstances, she might have found the wilderness genuinely romantic. Now, she saw it as an elegant execution chamber. "Wait until you see inside," Victor said, carrying their bags to the front door. "I had it specially prepared for this weekend." The interior of the cabin was indeed impressive, decorated with expensive rustic furniture and stocked with gourmet food and wine. It was clear that Victor had spared no expense in creating the perfect setting for what he believed would be Elena's final weekend. Elena explored the cabin methodically, noting that Victor had been truthful about the lack of cell phone service. Her phone showed no bars, and there was no landline anywhere in the building. If Elena needed help, she would have to rely entirely on the GPS tracker and hope that Agent Park could find her location in time. "I thought we could take a walk before dinner," Victor suggested after they had settled in. "There's a beautiful trail that leads to a waterfall." Elena's blood chilled as she realized that Victor was beginning to implement his plan. A waterfall would be the perfect place to stage an accident. A pregnant woman could easily slip on wet rocks, fall into rushing water, and drown before help could arrive. "That sounds lovely," Elena said, forcing enthusiasm into her voice. "Let me just freshen up first." In the cabin's bathroom, Elena checked her recording equipment and said a silent prayer to whatever powers might be watching over her. She was about to walk into a situation where her life and her child's life hung in the balance, and she would have to trust in her own preparation and the professionalism of Agent Park to keep them alive. When Elena emerged from the bathroom, she found Victor standing by the window with his back to her, speaking quietly into his phone. "Everything is proceeding as planned," Victor was saying. "The location is perfect. No witnesses, no cell service. It'll be hours before anyone could find her." Elena moved closer, hoping her hidden microphone would capture Victor's words as he updated Sophia on the progress of her murder. "The medical examiner will rule it an accident," Victor continued. "Pregnancy complications due to trauma from the fall. Your contact at the hospital is ready to sign off on whatever we need." Elena felt ice flow through her veins as she realized that Victor had coordinated every aspect of her murder and the subsequent cover-up. They had planned for every contingency except the possibility that Elena was recording their entire conversation. Victor ended the call and turned around, his expression shifting seamlessly from cold calculation to warm affection when he saw Elena. "Ready for that walk, darling?" he asked. "Absolutely," Elena replied, allowing Victor to help her with her jacket while silently wondering if this would be the last conversation they ever had as husband and wife. The trail to the waterfall was indeed beautiful, winding through old-growth forests that would have been peaceful under any other circumstances. Victor walked beside Elena, occasionally taking her arm to help her over rough patches of ground, playing the role of the attentive husband with Academy Award-worthy skill. But as they approached the sound of rushing water, Victor's demeanor began to change. Elena noticed a tension in his shoulders, a quickening of his pace that suggested he was building up courage for what he was about to do. "Elena," Victor said as they reached the rocky outcrop overlooking the waterfall, "I want you to know that despite everything that's happened between us lately, I do love you." The words sent a chill through Elena that had nothing to do with the mountain air. In her experience, when someone felt the need to declare their love unprompted, they were usually about to do something that proved the opposite. They stood at the edge of the cliff, with the waterfall thundering 30 feet below into a pool of dark water. Elena realized that they were now standing at the exact spot where Victor had planned to push her to her death. But as Victor moved behind her and placed his hands on her shoulders, something unexpected happened. Instead of the violent shove Elena had prepared for, Victor's grip remained gentle, almost hesitant. I can't do it this way, Victor whispered, and there was genuine anguish in his voice. Not like this. Not here. Elena turned to face her husband, confusion replacing fear for a moment. In the fading light, Victor's face was twisted with what looked like internal conflict, as if part of him was genuinely struggling with what he was about to do. Victor, what's wrong? Elena asked, though every instinct told her to run. I thought I could push you, Victor said, more to himself than to Elena. Make it look like an accident, but when I looked down at that water, all I could think about was our baby. Elena realized that Victor was having difficulty with the physical act of murder, not with the concept itself. The man who had seemed so coldly calculating was apparently struggling with the reality of personally ending his pregnant wife's life. Let's go back to the cabin, Victor said abruptly, taking Elena's arm with what seemed like genuine care. You must be tired. The walk back to the cabin was conducted in tense silence, with Elena's mind racing as she tried to understand what had just happened. Had Victor lost his nerve? Had he decided to abort his plan? Or was he simply choosing a different method to kill her? At the cabin, Victor poured himself a large glass of whiskey and sat heavily in one of the rustic chairs, his earlier confidence replaced by visible agitation. Victor, you're scaring me, Elena said, and for once, she didn't have to fake the emotion in her voice. Elena, I need you to understand something, Victor said, looking directly at her for the first time all evening. I never wanted it to come to this. Elena felt her heart stop as she realized that Victor was about to confess to his murder plan, and her hidden recording devices were capturing every word. Come to what? Elena asked, playing her part in what she now understood was Victor's psychological need to justify his actions to himself. I'm in trouble. Elena, deep trouble. The kind that doesn't go away with bankruptcy lawyers or public relations firms. Elena listened in shock as Victor revealed that his tech empire was built on fraudulent investments and money laundering for organized crime figures. He had stolen millions from the wrong people, and they had given him an ultimatum pay back what he owed with interest, or face consequences that would make death seem merciful. The $50 million from your life insurance would solve everything, Victor said, his voice breaking. It would pay off my debts and leave enough for Sophia and me to disappear somewhere they could never find us. Would solve, Elena repeated, noting the past tense. Victor stood up abruptly and walked to a cabinet that Elena hadn't noticed before. When he opened it, Elena saw rope, duct tape, a small shovel, and what appeared to be a makeshift coffin, the tools he had prepared for her murder. I thought I could make it quick at the waterfall, Victor continued, his voice now completely emotionless. But when it came down to it, I couldn't look into your eyes while I killed you and our baby. Elena backed toward the door, but Victor moved faster than she expected for someone who had been drinking heavily. He grabbed her arm with surprising gentleness, but his grip was firm and inescapable. So I've decided on something that will be easier for both of us, Victor said with the calm tone of someone who had convinced himself he was being merciful. You won't have to see it coming, and I won't have to watch you die. Elena realized with growing horror that Victor's apparent reprieve at the waterfall had simply meant he was moving to Plan B, burying her alive in a pre-made grave. Victor forced Elena to sit in a chair and began tying her hands with practiced efficiency. Elena could see that Victor had rehearsed this moment, planning every detail of how he would restrain and ultimately kill his pregnant wife. The grave is already dug behind the cabin, Victor explained as he worked, speaking in the same tone he might use to describe a business transaction. It's deep enough that you'll lose consciousness from oxygen deprivation before you suffocate completely. You won't suffer for long. Elena felt the full horror of Victor's plan wash over her. He was going to bury her alive, but he had convinced himself that this was somehow more humane than pushing her off a cliff. The psychological gymnastics required for such reasoning revealed a level of mental disturbance that Elena hadn't fully grasped before. Victor, you don't have to do this, Elena said, trying to keep her voice calm even as panic threatened to overwhelm her. We can work something out. I can help you with the business problems. Elena, you're an investigative journalist, Victor said with what sounded like genuine admiration. If anyone could figure out how to solve this mess, it would be you. But it's too late for that now. The people I owe money to don't negotiate. They collect, or they eliminate the debtor and everyone connected to them. As Victor finished tying Elena's hands, she realized that her husband had compartmentalized the murder in his mind, treating it like any other business decision that required unpleasant but necessary actions. He wasn't killing his wife and child out of passion or rage. He was executing them as calmly as he might terminate an underperforming employee. Victor dragged Elena outside to where he had indeed prepared a grave, deep enough and wide enough to accommodate her body and the makeshift coffin he had constructed. The sight of her own burial site, dug by her husband's hands, broke something inside Elena that she hadn't known could break. As Victor lowered Elena into the wooden box and then into the grave, she realized that her recording devices were capturing every moment of her own attempted murder. If she somehow survived this, the evidence would be overwhelming. But survival seemed increasingly unlikely as Victor began shoveling dirt over the coffin and the weight of the earth pressed down on the wooden lid above her. "Please," Elena whispered as the sound of falling dirt grew muffled and distant. "Please don't do this to our baby." But Victor either couldn't hear her through the earth and wood, or he had moved beyond the reach of her pleas. Elena found herself alone in absolute darkness, buried alive by the man who had promised to love and protect her. In those terrible moments, as the air grew thin and panic threatened to overwhelm her, Elena thought about the child growing inside her and made a promise that she would somehow find a way to live, if only to ensure that Victor faced justice for what he had done. The billionaire had buried his pregnant wife alive for his mistress, but Elena was determined that her escape would indeed shock the world. She just had to figure out how to dig her way out of her own grave first, and in the suffocating darkness of her premature burial, Elena began to claw her way toward what she hoped would be not just survival, but justice. Have you ever wondered how long you could survive buried alive? Elena was about to discover that when you're fighting for your child's life as well as your own, human endurance knows no limits. The darkness was absolute and crushing, pressing against Elena's face like a living thing determined to steal her breath. The wooden coffin Victor had constructed was barely larger than Elena's body, leaving no room to move her arms or legs. The weight of the earth above created a pressure that made every breath a conscious effort, and Elena could feel precious oxygen being consumed with each terrified gasp. But even as primal panic threatened to overwhelm her rational mind, Elena's investigative training kicked in. She forced herself to assess her situation with the methodical precision that had made her career. How much air did she have? How much dirt was above her? What tools did she have to work with Victor? In his narcissistic belief that he was being merciful, had made several crucial mistakes. In his eagerness to convince himself that Elena would lose consciousness peacefully, he had constructed a coffin with small gaps between the boards that allowed precious air to seep through. He had also been careless with the rope restraints, using standard hemp rope instead of more secure binding materials. More importantly, Victor's psychological need to justify his actions had led him to bury Elena in relatively loose soil rather than the packed earth of a traditional grave. This made it easier for him to dig, but it also gave Elena a chance, however slim, to dig her way out. Elena began working on the ropes around her wrists, using the rough wood of the coffin and small stones that had fallen through the gaps to fray the fibers. The process was agonizing, with each movement sending sharp pain through her already stressed body, but the thought of her unborn child gave her strength that she didn't know she possessed. As she worked to free her hands, Elena tried to estimate how long she'd been buried. The sensation of time in the grave was distorted by terror and oxygen deprivation, but based on her breathing rate and the growing stuffiness of the air, she guessed she had perhaps 20 to 30 minutes of oxygen remaining before she would lose consciousness. The baby moved inside her, a flutter of life that reminded Elena she wasn't just fighting for her own survival. The thought of her child dying in this makeshift grave filled Elena with a rage that burned away her panic and focused her mind with laser-like intensity. When Elena finally freed her hands, she began the terrifying process of trying to break out of the coffin. The wooden lid was only inches from her face, and she had to push against it while lying on her back with no leverage. Every push seemed futile, but Elena had studied accounts of other burial survivors, and she knew that panic was her greatest enemy. Think, Elena, she whispered to herself. You're an investigative journalist. This is just another problem to solve. Elena remembered reading about Harry Houdini's buried alive stunts and how he had emphasized the importance of remaining calm and conserving oxygen. She forced herself to control her breathing, taking slow, measured breaths that would preserve what little air remained while she worked to escape. Using her fingernails and small stones, Elena began working at the gaps between the coffin boards, trying to widen them enough to create leverage points. The work was exhausting and seemed impossibly slow, but gradually she was able to create spaces large enough to get her fingers through. The first board came loose with a crack that sounded like thunder in the confined space. Dirt immediately began pouring through the gap, and Elena realized that she was now in a race against time and suffocation. The loose soil that had made her burial easier was now threatening to fill the coffin and bury her more completely than Victor had intended. Elena clawed desperately at the earth above her, using her hands and broken fingernails to move soil away from her face and chest. Every handful of dirt that she displaced felt like a victory, but she was acutely aware that she was using her remaining oxygen at an alarming rate. The baby's movements had become more frantic, as if her child was responding to the decreasing oxygen levels in Elena's blood. Elena placed one hand on her belly and whispered, "Hold on, little one. Mommy's going to get us out of here." Halfway through her upward journey, Elena had to stop and rest, her heart pounding and her lungs burning from the effort. In that moment of forced stillness, she could hear something that made her blood run cold. Victor's voice, somewhere above her, talking on his phone again. "It's done," Victor was saying, his voice muffled but audible through the earth. "Elena had a tragic accident during our romantic getaway. She slipped and fell while we were hiking near the waterfall. I'm devastated, of course, but these things happen." Elena realized that while she was fighting for her life underground, Victor was already implementing the cover story for her murder. He was probably calling Sophia, coordinating their alibis and preparing for the performance of grief that would follow Elena's accidental death. The sound of Victor's voice gave Elena a geographical reference point, allowing her to adjust her digging direction. But it also reminded her that even if she managed to escape her grave, Victor was still nearby and would undoubtedly try to finish what he had started if he discovered her survival. Elena resumed digging with renewed urgency, knowing that Victor would probably leave the area soon to establish his alibi elsewhere. If she was going to escape, it had to be while she still had a chance to record more evidence of his crimes. As Elena clawed through the earth, she thought about all the women throughout history who had been buried alive, some accidentally, some as punishment, some as murder. She thought about the terror they must have felt and the strength they must have found to keep fighting even when death seemed certain. "I'm not going to be another statistic," Elena gasped as she pushed through another layer of soil. "My baby and I are going to survive this, and Victor's going to pay for what he's done." Elena's fingers finally broke through to the surface, and she felt cool night air on her hand like a benediction. The rush of oxygen gave her the final burst of energy she needed to dig herself completely free from the grave that her husband had prepared for her. Emerging from the earth like something from a horror movie, Elena was covered in dirt and blood, her maternity dress torn and her body shaking from exhaustion and trauma. But she was alive, and more importantly, her baby was alive and still moving inside her. Elena forced herself to move away from the gravesite, knowing that Victor might return at any moment. She found shelter behind a large tree and checked her recording equipment, amazed to discover that the devices had survived her burial and had captured Victor's entire murder attempt. From her hiding place, Elena could see Victor through the cabin windows, pacing as he spoke on his phone with animated gestures. She could only catch fragments of his conversation, but what she heard was enough to confirm that he was coordinating with Sophia and their hospital contact to implement their cover-up plan. Elena realized that this was her chance to gather additional evidence while Victor believed she was dead. She activated her phone's camera and began recording Victor's movements, capturing his relaxed demeanor and casual conversation as he planned to claim her life insurance money. But Elena knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. She was injured, exhausted, and in need of medical attention for both herself and her baby. More importantly, she needed to get her evidence to Agent Park before Victor realized she had survived and tried to silence her permanently. Elena began making her way through the forest toward where she hoped to find the FBI surveillance team. Every step was agony, but she forced herself to keep moving, knowing that her escape would mean nothing if Victor caught her before she could reach safety. As Elena stumbled through the darkness, guided by the GPS coordinates Agent Park had given her, she thought about the recording devices that had captured every moment of her husband's betrayal and attempted murder. When the truth finally came out, the world would indeed be shocked by the depths of a billionaire's depravity. But first, Elena had to survive the night and get her evidence to people who could use it to bring Victor to justice. The pregnant wife who had been buried alive was about to shock the world with her survival and her proof of her husband's ultimate betrayal. Behind her, Elena could hear Victor's voice growing fainter as she moved deeper into the forest. He was still on the phone, still coordinating the cover-up of her murder, still believing that he had successfully eliminated the only witness to his crimes. Victor had no idea that his intended victim was not only alive, but had recorded every detail of his attempt to bury her alive for his mistress. The shock that was about to hit him would be nothing compared to the shock that would soon reverberate around the world. What happens when someone returns from the dead? Elena was about to discover that surviving attempted murder was only the beginning of her fight for justice. Elena's journey through the forest took 4 hours of the most difficult travel of her life. Every step sent shooting pains through her body, and she had to stop frequently to rest and check on her baby's movement. When she finally reached the coordinates where Agent Park's surveillance team was stationed, Elena collapsed into the arms of FBI agents who had been frantically searching for her. "Dear God, Elena!" Agent Park breathed as she helped Elena into the medical van that had been standing by. "We lost your GPS signal hours ago. We thought—" "I'm alive!" Elena gasped, her voice hoarse from dirt and terror. "And I got everything on tape. Victor buried me alive, but I recorded the whole thing." The FBI team immediately began processing the scene while paramedics examined Elena and her baby. The news that Elena had survived being buried alive spread quickly through law enforcement channels, and within hours, the story was breaking on every major news network. "Pregnant woman survives being buried alive by billionaire husband" became the headline that dominated news cycles around the world. The public reaction was immediate and explosive, a mixture of horror at Victor's crime and amazement at Elena's survival. Social media erupted with support for Elena and outrage at Victor's betrayal. The hashtag #Passion Buried But Not Broken began trending worldwide as people shared their own stories of survival and resilience. Elena's escape had indeed shocked the world, but the response was overwhelmingly supportive. But even as Elena was being treated at the hospital and Victor was being arrested at the cabin, a more insidious campaign was beginning. Victor's expensive legal team immediately launched a counterattack designed to destroy Elena's credibility and turn public opinion against her. Within 48 hours of Elena's rescue, Victor's lawyers were appearing on every major news program, claiming that Elena had staged the entire incident as part of an elaborate scheme to frame her husband and steal his fortune. Mrs. Harrington has a history of mental health issues that have been exacerbated by her pregnancy. Victor's lead attorney, Martin Blackwood, announced at a press conference, "Our investigation will show that she dug her own grave, buried herself in a shallow hole for a few hours, and then emerged to claim attempted murder. This is a desperate woman's attempt to destroy a successful man's reputation." The defense strategy was sophisticated and well-funded. Victor's team hired private investigators to dig into Elena's past, looking for any evidence of mental instability or financial desperation. They brought in expert witnesses who claimed that Elena's burial wasn't deep enough to be truly life-threatening, and that her escape was evidence that the whole incident had been staged. Most damaging of all, Victor's lawyers obtained Elena's medical records and revealed that she had been prescribed antidepressants during the early stages of her pregnancy, medication that they claim proved she was mentally unstable and capable of elaborate self-harm. This is a woman who was willing to endanger her own unborn child to frame her husband, Blackwood declared on national television. The so-called evidence she gathered is the product of a delusional mind that has created an elaborate fantasy of persecution. The public opinion that had initially supported Elena began to shift. Social media filled with speculation about her mental state and her true motivations. The hashtag Chalk buried but not broken was replaced by buried in lies as Victor's supporters spread doubt about Elena's story. Elena watched this character assassination unfold from her hospital bed, feeling a despair that was in some ways worse than what she had experienced in the grave. At least when she was buried alive, she had known who her enemy was and what she was fighting against. Now, she was battling a narrative that portrayed her as a mentally unstable woman who had endangered her own child for money and attention. "They're destroying everything," Elena told Agent Park during one of their meetings. "Even if we prove Victor tried to kill me, people will always wonder if I made the whole thing up." "Elena, we have the recording devices," Agent Park reminded her. "We have Victor's voice planning your murder and bragging about it afterward. We have Sophia's involvement documented. The evidence is overwhelming." But Elena understood something that the FBI agent didn't in the court of public opinion. Evidence could be less important than narrative. Victor's team was crafting a story that played into existing prejudices about pregnant women, mental health, and the believability of domestic violence victims. The media coverage became increasingly sensationalized, with tabloid headlines asking, "Did pregnant wife bury herself alive?" In Billionaire's wife, victim, or villain? Television programs dedicated entire episodes to analyzing Elena's facial expressions and body language, looking for signs that she was lying about her ordeal. Elena's support system began to crack under the pressure. Some of her former colleagues at the newspaper distanced themselves from her, afraid that association with such a controversial figure would damage their own careers. Old friends stopped returning her calls, uncertain whether to believe her story or the competing narrative being promoted by Victor's legal team. Even Elena's family began to express doubts. Her sister Maria visited Elena in the hospital and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Elena, you would tell me if you were having some kind of breakdown, wouldn't you? If you needed help." "Maria, you think I buried myself alive?" Elena asked, hardly believing that her own sister could doubt her. "I don't know what to think," Maria admitted. "The lawyers are saying you had access to all of Victor's accounts, that you could have set this whole thing up. They're saying the grave wasn't even deep enough to kill you." Elena realized that Victor's strategy was working perfectly. By casting doubt on the severity of her burial and suggesting she had staged the incident, his lawyers were making it difficult for even her closest family members to fully believe her story. The psychological impact of this collective doubt was devastating. Elena had survived attempted murder only to face a different kind of assault, one that attacked her credibility, her sanity, and her worth as a human being. The woman who had clawed her way out of a grave now had to fight her way out of a web of lies and character assassination. But Elena had one advantage that Victor's team couldn't destroy the recordings. The FBI had enhanced the audio from Elena's hidden devices, and the tapes clearly captured Victor planning her murder, burying her alive, and coordinating with Sophia to cover up his crimes. "Let them question my mental state," Elena told Agent Park during one of their strategy sessions. "But they can't question Victor's voice on these recordings. When the jury hears him planning to kill his pregnant wife for insurance money, all the character assassination in the world won't save him." Elena also began to understand that the public scrutiny, while painful, was actually helping to build the case against Victor. The more attention the story received, the more people came forward with information about Victor's criminal activities and Sophia's manipulative behavior. A former employee of Victor's company contacted the FBI with evidence that Victor had been embezzling funds for years. A hotel worker came forward with testimony about Victor and Sophia's affair. Most importantly, Dr. Morrison, the corrupt medical examiner who had agreed to falsify Elena's death certificate, decided to cooperate with prosecutors rather than face charges himself. The public pressure is actually working in our favor, Agent Park explained to Elena. All this media attention is encouraging witnesses to come forward who might otherwise have stayed silent. Elena realized that while Victor's legal team was winning the short-term battle for public opinion, they were inadvertently helping to build the case that would ultimately destroy him. The more they claimed Elena's story was impossible, the more investigators dug into the evidence that proved it was true. Elena's false victory in the court of public opinion would eventually become a real victory in the court of law. But first, she would have to endure months of having her sanity, her motives, and her character questioned by a world that found it easier to believe a pregnant woman was delusional than to accept that a billionaire could be capable of murder. The woman who had been buried alive had escaped from her grave, but now she had to escape from a different kind of burial, one that threatened to bury her reputation and credibility forever. Elena's fight for justice was just beginning, and the world was indeed about to be shocked by what she would uncover about the depths of her husband's depravity. How do you recover from being buried alive when the people who should be protecting you are questioning your sanity? Elena was about to discover that surviving attempted murder was only the first challenge in her fight for justice. Elena's medical team at Mount Sinai Hospital was treating more than just her physical injuries from being buried alive. Dr. Sarah Kim, the obstetrician overseeing Elena's care, was concerned about the psychological trauma and its potential impact on both Elena and her unborn child. Your baby's heart rate shows signs of stress, Dr. Kim explained during Elena's second day in the hospital. We need to monitor both of you closely for the next several weeks to ensure there are no complications from the oxygen deprivation you experienced. But Elena's medical recovery was complicated by the legal and media circus surrounding her case. Hospital security had to be increased after reporters and Victor's private investigators attempted to gain access to Elena's room. Even more disturbing, Elena began to suspect that not everyone on her medical team believed her story. Dr. James Wright, the hospital's chief psychiatrist, visited Elena under the guise of providing trauma counseling, but his questions seemed designed to evaluate her mental stability rather than help her heal. Elena, I want you to know that this is a safe space, Dr. Wright said during their first session. Sometimes when people are under extreme stress, they can create elaborate scenarios that feel completely real to them. There's no shame in that. Elena realized that Dr. Wright had been influenced by the media coverage suggesting she had staged her own burial. Even her own medical team was questioning whether she was mentally stable enough to accurately report what had happened to her. Doctor, are you suggesting that I imagined being buried alive by my husband? Elena asked directly. I'm suggesting that trauma can affect memory and perception in ways that even intelligent people don't realize. Dr. Wright replied carefully. The important thing is getting you the help you need. Elena understood that she was being evaluated not just as a patient, but as a potential mental health case whose testimony might be unreliable. The realization that even her doctors doubted her story sent Elena into a spiral of despair that was worse than anything she had experienced in the grave. Late that night, Elena suffered what appeared to be early labor contractions brought on by stress and trauma. As medical staff rushed to stabilize her pregnancy, Elena realized that Victor's attempt to kill her and their child was continuing even from his jail cell, through the psychological warfare being waged by his legal team. Please don't let my baby die, Elena whispered to Dr. Kim as the contractions intensified. Victor's already tried to kill us once. Don't let him succeed now. Dr. Kim worked through the night to stop Elena's premature labor, using medications and monitoring equipment to stabilize both mother and child. But the incident had been traumatic for Elena, who began to understand that her fight for survival was far from over. The next morning brought more devastating news. Detective Santos visited Elena with information that Victor's legal team had uncovered in their investigation of her background. Elena, I need to prepare you for what's coming, Santos said gently. Victor's lawyers have obtained your prescription records, and they're planning to use your antidepressant medication as evidence of mental instability. Elena had been prescribed antidepressants early in her pregnancy to help manage the anxiety she had felt about Victor's increasingly erratic behavior. The medication was completely legal and had been prescribed by her obstetrician as a safe treatment for prenatal depression. But Victor's lawyers were spinning the prescription as evidence that Elena was mentally unstable and capable of elaborate self-harm. They were also highlighting the fact that Elena had stopped taking the medication without telling Victor, suggesting that her decision to go off antidepressants had triggered a psychotic episode. They're saying that you went off your medication, became delusional, and created an elaborate fantasy about Victor trying to kill you, Santos explained. They're claiming that you dug the grave yourself during one of Victor's business trips, and then buried yourself in it when he suggested the weekend getaway. Elena felt the walls closing in around her as she realized the sophistication of Victor's defense strategy. His lawyers weren't just claiming that she had lied about the attempted murder. They were suggesting that she genuinely believed her own delusions and had endangered her unborn child in service of her mental illness. But the recording devices captured everything, Elena protested. Victor's voice planning my murder, him actually burying me, his calls to Sophia afterward. How can they explain that away? They're claiming that you recorded those conversations out of context, that Victor was discussing a movie script or a novel plot. Santos replied, they're saying that your pregnancy hormones and medication withdrawal caused you to misinterpret innocent conversations as evidence of a murder plot. Elena realized that Victor's team was using every prejudice and misconception about pregnant women, mental health, and domestic violence to destroy her credibility. They were portraying her as an unstable woman whose pregnancy had made her paranoid and delusional. The media coverage became increasingly hostile as Victor's narrative gained traction. Television psychiatrists who had never met Elena appeared on talk shows to discuss how pregnancy could trigger psychotic episodes. Legal experts debated whether Elena should be charged with filing a false police report and endangering her unborn child. Most painfully, Elena began receiving messages from other domestic violence survivors who questioned whether her story was real. Women who had experienced genuine abuse worried that Elena's case, if it was indeed fabricated, would make it harder for real victims to be believed. You're making it harder for all of us, one woman wrote to Elena on social media. If you're lying about this, you're setting back the cause of domestic violence awareness by decades. Elena realized that Victor's strategy was not just destroying her credibility, but potentially damaging the broader movement to support domestic violence survivors. The case that should have been a clear example of intimate partner violence was being used to reinforce skepticism about women's testimony. But Elena also began to receive support from an unexpected source, forensic experts who had examined the evidence independently of the FBI investigation. Dr. Michelle Torres, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in domestic violence cases, reviewed Elena's recordings and medical records and concluded that her story was not only believable, but entirely consistent with patterns of intimate partner terrorism. Elena's case shows classic signs of financial abuse, psychological manipulation, and escalating violence. Dr. Torres testified to a congressional committee investigating domestic violence. The suggestion that she staged her own attempted murder is not just implausible, it's impossible given the evidence. Dr. Torres's analysis included details that Victor's defense team couldn't explain away: the sophisticated planning required for the murder plot, the coordination with multiple conspirators, and the medical evidence of genuine oxygen deprivation during Elena's burial. You cannot fake the physiological signs of being buried alive, Dr. Torres explained. Elena's blood oxygen levels, her tissue damage, and her stress hormone levels all confirm that she experienced genuine, life-threatening trauma. Elena's case began to attract support from domestic violence organizations around the world, who recognized that the attack on Elena's credibility was really an attack on all survivors of intimate partner violence. Major advocacy groups issued statements supporting Elena, and condemning the victim-blaming tactics being used by Victor's defense team. But the psychological toll on Elena was enormous. The woman who had survived being buried alive was now being buried under an avalanche of doubt, skepticism, and character assassination. Some days, Elena wondered if it would have been easier to die in the grave than to survive only to have her sanity and credibility questioned by the entire world. Sometimes I think Victor's plan is working perfectly, Elena confided to Agent Park during one of their meetings. He wanted to destroy me, and even though I survived the burial, he's destroying my reputation and my credibility instead. Elena, the truth has a way of coming out, Agent Park replied. We have the evidence, we have the recordings, and we're building a case that will not only convict Victor, but also vindicate you completely. Elena clung to that hope as she continued her recovery in the hospital, knowing that the battle for her life was far from over. The woman who had clawed her way out of a grave would have to claw her way out of a character assassination campaign that threatened to bury her just as completely as Victor's original plan. But Elena was determined to fight back. She had survived attempted murder, and she would survive this attempt to murder her reputation. The truth about Victor's crimes would eventually shock the world. But first, Elena had to survive the lies that threatened to destroy her credibility forever. When you think you've survived the worst that life can throw at you, how do you cope when 3 devastating blows hit in rapid succession? Elena was about to learn that Victor's attempts to destroy her extended far beyond their original plan. Elena had been in the hospital for 5 days when the first catastrophe struck. She was reviewing legal documents with her attorney when Detective Santos arrived with news that would shatter what little sense of security she had managed to rebuild. Elena, I need to tell you about your sister Maria, Santos said, her expression grave. She was in a car accident this morning. Elena's world tilted on its axis. Is she alive? She's in intensive care. The doctors say it's touch and go. But as Santos provided more details about the accident, Elena realized that this was no random tragedy. Maria's car had been forced off the road by a black SUV that had fled the scene. Security cameras showed that the SUV had been following Maria for several miles before causing the collision. This is Victor, Elena said with certainty. He's trying to isolate me by attacking the people I love. Santos nodded grimly. We're investigating the possibility that this was intentional. The SUV had stolen plates, and the driver knew exactly how to cause maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Elena realized that Victor was implementing a campaign of terrorism designed to break her psychologically. Even from jail, he was using his resources and connections to attack anyone who might support or corroborate Elena's story. Elena was still processing the news about Maria when the second catastrophe hit. Agent Park arrived at the hospital with news that made Elena's blood run cold. Elena, we have a problem with the evidence, Park said. Someone broke into the FBI storage facility where we were keeping your recording devices and documentation. Elena felt the room spinning around her. What do you mean, broke in? Professional job. They knew exactly where to go and what to take. They left behind anything that wasn't directly related to your case. But they got the original recording devices and several crucial pieces of physical evidence. Elena realized that Victor's legal team had somehow orchestrated the theft of the evidence that could convict him. Without the original recordings, the prosecution's case would rely on copies that Victor's lawyers could claim had been doctored or fabricated. How is that possible? Elena asked. Don't you have security protocols? We do. But whoever did this had inside information about our storage procedures and security schedules. Park admitted. This was someone with law enforcement connections or someone who paid for that information. Elena understood that she was facing an enemy with virtually unlimited resources and no moral constraints. Victor was willing to corrupt federal agents, stage accidents, and destroy evidence to avoid conviction for his crimes. But the worst was yet to come. Later that same day, as Elena was trying to process the implications of losing her sister and her evidence, Dr. Kim arrived with news that completed Elena's devastation. Elena, I need to discuss your test results, Dr. Kim said, her voice carefully neutral. We've detected some abnormalities in your baby's development that are consistent with oxygen deprivation during your burial. Elena felt her heart stop. What kind of abnormalities? Potential developmental delays, possible hearing impairment, and elevated risk of neurological complications. Dr. Kim explained gently, we won't know the full extent until after birth, but the trauma you experienced has likely affected your baby's development. Elena realized that Victor's attempt to murder her had succeeded in damaging their child. Even though she had survived, the baby she had fought so hard to protect had been harmed by the very act of that protection. Is my baby going to be okay? Elena whispered. We're doing everything we can to minimize the damage and support healthy development. Dr. Kim replied, but I won't lie to you. There may be lifelong consequences from what happened to you both. Elena broke down completely. In the span of a single day, she had lost her sister's health, her evidence against Victor, and her certainty that her child would be born healthy. The triple catastrophes felt like a coordinated attack designed to destroy her will to fight. That night, Elena experienced what would later be recognized as a severe mental health crisis. The combination of trauma, isolation, and devastating losses triggered a psychological breakdown that left her barely functional. Elena found herself unable to eat, sleep, or focus on anything beyond the overwhelming sense that Victor was systematically destroying everything she cared about. She began to question whether fighting for justice was worth the cost to her family and her unborn child. Maybe I should just give up, Elena told Agent Park during one of her darkest moments. Maybe I should accept whatever plea deal Victor's lawyers offer and try to protect what's left of my family. Park recognized that Elena was being psychologically crushed by the coordinated assault on her life and support system. Elena, that's exactly what Victor wants. He's trying to break you so that you'll stop fighting for justice. But Elena was beginning to understand that justice might be impossible when facing an opponent with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. Victor had demonstrated that he could attack her family, corrupt evidence, and manipulate the legal system with impunity. The media coverage of Elena's crisis painted her breakdown as further evidence of mental instability. Headlines like, "Buried alive woman suffers mental collapse," and "Is Elena Harrington having a breakdown?" reinforced the narrative that Victor's lawyers were promoting. Elena's psychiatrist, Dr. Wright, used her crisis as an opportunity to push for a more comprehensive mental health evaluation. Elena, these recent events have clearly triggered a severe psychological episode, he said. I think we need to consider the possibility that your original trauma was more complicated than you remember. Elena realized that even her mental health crisis was being weaponized against her by people who wanted to discredit her testimony. The breakdown that should have been seen as a natural response to devastating losses was being treated as evidence of underlying mental illness. But in her darkest moment, Elena received unexpected support from a source that would change everything. Maria, despite her injuries, had regained consciousness and was able to provide crucial information about the SUV that had forced her off the road. Elena, Maria whispered from her hospital bed. I saw the driver's face right before the impact. It was that woman from the photos you showed me. Victor's mistress. Elena realized that Sophia had personally carried out the attack on Maria, providing direct evidence of the conspiracy to intimidate and silence Elena's supporters. This revelation gave Elena the strength to continue fighting, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The triple catastrophes that had nearly destroyed Elena's will to fight would ultimately become the evidence that proved Victor and Sophia's willingness to use any means necessary to escape justice. But first, Elena would have to find the strength to rise from the ashes of her worst day and continue the fight for her life and her child's future. The woman who had been buried alive was being buried again, this time under an avalanche of attacks designed to break her spirit. But Elena was beginning to understand that survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant refusing to let her enemies destroy her capacity to fight for what was right. What happens when you think you've finally gained the upper hand, only to discover that your enemy has been setting an even more devastating trap? Elena was about to learn that legal victories could be turned into weapons against the very people they were meant to protect. 3 weeks after the triple catastrophes, Elena finally received what seemed like good news. Despite the theft of evidence and the attacks on her support system, the district attorney's office had managed to secure enough evidence to proceed with charges against Victor for attempted murder, conspiracy, and insurance fraud. "We're confident we can get a conviction," District Attorney Sarah Chen told Elena during a pretrial meeting. "Even without the original recording devices, we have copies of the audio, witness testimony, and physical evidence from the gravesite. Victor's going to pay for what he did to you." Elena felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. She had survived being buried alive, withstood a character assassination campaign, and endured devastating attacks on her family. Now, finally, it seemed like justice might prevail. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for early December, and Elena spent weeks preparing her testimony with prosecutor Jennifer Walsh. Elena's story was compelling and detailed, and the evidence seemed overwhelming despite Victor's attempts to destroy it. "Elena, you're going to be a phenomenal witness," Walsh told her during one of their preparation sessions. "Your background as an investigative journalist gives you credibility, and your detailed documentation of Victor's crimes shows premeditation on his part." Elena began to feel cautiously optimistic about the outcome of the trial. The media coverage had started to shift as more evidence emerged about Victor's criminal activities and Sophia's role in the conspiracy. Public opinion was slowly turning back in Elena's favor. The preliminary hearing arrived in December, and Elena felt stronger than she had in months. Her pregnancy was progressing well despite the earlier complications, and Maria was recovering from her injuries. For the first time since being buried alive, Elena felt like she might actually win this fight. Judge Patricia Morrison presided over the hearing, and Elena was impressed by her no-nonsense approach to managing the proceedings. Judge Morrison had a reputation for being tough on domestic violence cases and unsympathetic to defendants who tried to manipulate the system. "Mr. Harrington," Judge Morrison said as she reviewed the charges, "you are accused of attempting to murder your pregnant wife for financial gain. How do you plead?" Victor, dressed in an expensive suit and flanked by his legal team, spoke in a clear voice. "Not guilty, Your Honor. My wife is suffering from a severe mental illness that has caused her to fabricate these accusations." Elena expected this response, but she was confident that the evidence would speak for itself. Prosecutor Walsh had prepared a compelling presentation that included audio recordings, witness testimony, and expert analysis of the burial site. But as the hearing progressed, Elena began to notice something troubling. Judge Morrison seemed unusually receptive to arguments from Victor's defense team, asking pointed questions about Elena's mental health history and the circumstances surrounding her discovery of the alleged plot. "Ms. Martinez," Judge Morrison said to Elena during her testimony, using Elena's maiden name instead of her married name, "can you explain to the court why you chose to continue this alleged investigation instead of immediately reporting your concerns to law enforcement?" Elena answered the question thoroughly, explaining her background as an investigative journalist and her need to gather sufficient evidence to ensure Victor's conviction. But Judge Morrison's tone suggested skepticism about Elena's motivations and decision-making. The defense presentation was devastating in its thoroughness. Victor's lawyers had assembled a team of expert witnesses who testified about pregnancy-related mental health issues, the effects of hormone fluctuations on perception and memory, and the possibility that Elena had created an elaborate delusion to explain her deteriorating marriage. Dr. Richard Steinberg, a forensic psychiatrist hired by the defense, testified that Elena's behavior was consistent with a rare pregnancy-related psychotic disorder that could cause elaborate paranoid delusions. "Mrs. Harrington genuinely believes that her husband tried to kill her," Dr. Steinberg testified, "but her belief is the product of a severe mental illness, not actual events. The evidence suggests that she staged the burial herself during a psychotic episode." Elena watched in horror as her own medical records were dissected in open court. Her prescription for antidepressants, her decision to stop taking them, and her history of work-related stress were all presented as evidence of underlying mental instability. But the most devastating blow came when Victor's lawyers called a surprise witness, Dr. Morrison, the corrupt medical examiner who had originally agreed to falsify Elena's death certificate. Instead of testifying for the prosecution as expected, Dr. Morrison had been flipped by Victor's legal team and was now claiming that he had never agreed to participate in any murder plot. Mr. Harrington contacted me about writing a crime novel, Dr. Morrison testified under oath. He was researching how medical examiners determine cause of death for his fictional story. Mrs. Harrington has taken these innocent conversations out of context to support her delusions. Elena felt the courtroom spinning around her as she realized that Victor's lawyers had successfully corrupted or intimidated every witness who could support her story. The evidence that should have convicted Victor was being reinterpreted to support the defense narrative that Elena was mentally ill. The hearing's conclusion was devastating. Judge Morrison ruled that while there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, she was ordering Elena to undergo a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation to determine her competency to testify. The court is concerned about the complainant's mental state and her ability to distinguish between reality and delusion, Judge Morrison announced. Before this case can proceed, we need independent verification that Mrs. Harrington is competent to provide reliable testimony. Elena realized that she had walked into a trap. What should have been her legal vindication had been turned into another weapon against her credibility. Now, instead of preparing for Victor's trial, she would be forced to undergo psychiatric evaluation that could potentially declare her incompetent and dismiss all charges against Victor. As Elena left the courthouse that day, she understood that her fight for justice had become more complicated than ever. Victor's legal team had successfully transformed the legal system from a source of protection into another instrument of psychological warfare. The woman who had survived being buried alive was now being buried under legal maneuvers designed to declare her insane and discredit her testimony. Elena's escape from the grave had shocked the world, but Victor's escape from justice threatened to shock it even more. Elena knew that she would have to find new sources of strength and new allies if she wanted to continue fighting for the truth. The courtroom that should have been her sanctuary had become another battleground, and Elena was beginning to understand that her enemy was willing to corrupt every institution necessary to avoid accountability for his crimes. But Elena had learned something important about herself during her time underground. She was capable of surviving anything, and if she could claw her way out of a grave, she could claw her way out of a legal system that was being manipulated to protect her would-be killer. The battle for justice was far from over, and Elena was determined to shock the world one more time, this time with the truth that would finally destroy Victor's carefully constructed lies. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources. Just when Elena thought the entire world had turned against her, she was about to discover that Victor's web of corruption had created its own enemies, people who were ready to risk everything to see justice done. Elena's court-ordered psychiatric evaluation was scheduled to begin the following week, and she was struggling with the reality that her mental competency was now being questioned by the very legal system that should have been protecting her. She sat in her hospital room, 7 months pregnant and feeling more isolated than ever, when Detective Santos arrived with news that would change everything. "Elena, I want you to meet someone," Santos said, stepping aside to reveal a woman Elena didn't recognize. "This is Agent Claire Whitfield from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit." Agent Whitfield was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to taking on powerful adversaries. She sat down across from Elena and spoke in a direct, no-nonsense tone. "Mrs. Harrington, my unit has been investigating corruption in the federal court system, and your case has raised several red flags. We believe that Judge Morrison may have been compromised." Elena felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. "What do you mean, compromised?" "Judge Morrison received a substantial payment to her offshore account 3 days before your preliminary hearing," Agent Whitfield explained. "The money came from a shell company that we've traced back to Victor's business empire." Elena realized that Victor's corruption extended even deeper than she had imagined. He hadn't just bribed a medical examiner or intimidated witnesses. He had purchased a federal judge to ensure that Elena's testimony would be discredited. We've also discovered that Dr. Morrison, the medical examiner who changed his testimony, has gambling debts that were recently paid off by another company connected to Victor. Agent Whitfield continued, "Your husband has been systematically corrupting everyone involved in your case." But Agent Whitfield had more revelations that would reshape Elena's understanding of her situation. The FBI's investigation had uncovered evidence that Victor's criminal activities extended far beyond insurance fraud and attempted murder. Victor's tech company has been laundering money for organized crime figures for the past 3 years. Agent Whitfield explained, "He's not just a businessman who tried to kill his wife. He's a key player in a massive criminal enterprise." Elena learned that Victor's desperation to collect her life insurance money was driven by his need to pay off debts to Russian organized crime figures, who were growing impatient with his delays. Elena's murder had been planned not just for the insurance money, but to eliminate a potential witness to Victor's criminal activities. "We believe Victor was planning to disappear with Sophia after your death," Agent Whitfield said. "They had already established new identities and offshore accounts in preparation for leaving the country permanently." This information reframed Elena's case entirely. She wasn't just a domestic violence victim. She was a witness to federal crimes involving money laundering, racketeering, and international criminal conspiracy. But Agent Whitfield's most important revelation was yet to come. The FBI had been monitoring Victor's communications from jail, and they had discovered that he was still actively trying to eliminate Elena and other witnesses who could testify against him. "Victor has been using his lawyers as intermediaries to coordinate attacks on you and your family," Agent Whitfield explained. "The attack on your sister, the theft of evidence, even the corruption of Judge Morrison, all of it has been orchestrated from his jail cell." Elena realized that Victor's legal team wasn't just defending him, they were serving as the operational command center for his ongoing criminal activities. The attorneys who claimed to be officers of the court were actually helping Victor continue his campaign of intimidation and corruption. Agent Whitfield revealed that the FBI had been building a federal case against Victor that would supersede the state charges and provide much stronger protection for Elena and other witnesses. "We're preparing RICO charges against Victor and his entire organization," Agent Whitfield said. "Racketeering, money laundering, witness tampering, judicial corruption. He's looking at life in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Elena felt a surge of hope, but she also understood that escalating the case to the federal level would make her an even bigger target for Victor's associates. "What about my safety?" Elena asked. "If Victor is working with organized crime figures, won't they try to eliminate me to protect their operations?" "That's why we're putting you in the Federal Witness Protection Program," Agent Whitfield replied. "Effective immediately, you'll be moved to a secure facility where we can protect you until Victor's trial is completed." Elena realized that her life was about to change dramatically once again. She would be separated from her remaining family and friends, hidden away in a federal safe house while preparing to testify against one of the most dangerous criminal organizations the FBI had ever investigated. But Agent Whitfield had one more surprise that would give Elena the ally she needed most. The FBI had been contacted by an investigative journalist named David Chen, who had been researching Victor's criminal activities independently and had uncovered evidence that corroborated everything Elena had discovered. Chen has been investigating Victor for a book about corporate crime and organized crime infiltration of legitimate businesses, Agent Whitfield explained. "He's willing to testify about his findings and help us build the case against Victor." Elena met with David Chen that same day and was amazed by the thoroughness of his research. Chen had documented Victor's money laundering activities, his connections to organized crime figures, and his pattern of intimidating or eliminating anyone who threatened to expose his crimes. "Elena, your case is the key to bringing down an entire criminal network," Chen told her. "Victor's not just a killer, he's a central figure in a conspiracy that extends across multiple states and involves dozens of co-conspirators." Chen had also discovered something that gave Elena hope for her psychiatric evaluation. He had found evidence that the defense team's expert witness, Dr. Steinberg, had been paid to provide false testimony in other cases involving domestic violence. Dr. Steinberg has a history of testifying that domestic violence victims are mentally ill when he's paid enough money. Chen explained, "We can destroy his credibility and show that his testimony about your mental state is part of Victor's corruption campaign." Elena realized that she was no longer fighting alone against Victor's vast resources and connections. The FBI, a respected investigative journalist, and a growing network of federal investigators were now working to expose the truth about Victor's crimes. But Elena also understood that the stakes had been raised dramatically. She was no longer just fighting for justice in a domestic violence case. She was helping to bring down a criminal organization that would stop at nothing to protect itself. As Elena prepared to enter witness protection, she thought about how far she had come from the woman who had been buried alive in the woods. That terrified pregnant woman had become a federal witness whose testimony would help expose corruption at the highest levels of society. Elena's allies were finally emerging from the shadows, but her enemies were about to reveal themselves as more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The woman who had shocked the world by escaping from her grave was about to help shock it again by exposing the criminal conspiracy that had nearly succeeded in burying her forever. What happens when you realize that your attempted murder was just one small part of a criminal conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of society? Elena was about to discover that the rabbit hole of Victor's corruption went deeper than anyone had imagined. Elena's first week in federal witness protection was spent in a secure facility outside Washington, D.C., where FBI investigators debriefed her about every aspect of her relationship with Victor. What they discovered during these sessions would reshape the entire investigation and reveal the true scope of Victor's criminal activities. "Elena, I need you to think carefully about Victor's business associates over the past few years," Agent Whitfield said during one of their sessions. "Anyone who visited your home, anyone he spoke about with unusual frequency, anyone who seemed to make him nervous." As Elena recounted her memories, a pattern began to emerge that she hadn't recognized while living through it. Victor's behavior changes hadn't been gradual. They had coincided with specific business relationships and financial pressures that Elena was only now beginning to understand. "There was a man named Dmitry Volkov who started visiting our home about 2 years ago," Elena remembered. "Victor always introduced him as a potential investor, but something about him made me uncomfortable. He had this way of looking at me that felt like he was evaluating me as a potential threat." Agent Whitfield's expression grew grave as Elena described Volkov. "Elena, Dmitry Volkov is one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. He's a Russian organized crime leader who specializes in money laundering and elimination of witnesses. If he was visiting your home regularly, you were in much more danger than we initially realized." Elena learned that Victor's tech company had been serving as a front for Volkov's money laundering operations, processing millions of dollars in illegal funds through fake transactions and shell companies. Victor hadn't just been stealing money, he had been helping one of the world's most dangerous criminals hide the proceeds of human trafficking, drug smuggling, and arms dealing. "This explains why Victor was so desperate to kill you," Agent Whitfield said. "You weren't just a witness to insurance fraud. You were a potential witness to federal crimes that could have brought down Volkov's entire operation." Elena's investigation took on new urgency as the FBI realized that she possessed knowledge that could help them build cases against dozens of criminals beyond Victor and Sophia. Every dinner party, every business meeting, every conversation she had overheard might contain evidence of criminal conspiracy. But Elena's deeper involvement in the federal investigation also revealed new threats to her safety. The FBI's monitoring of organized crime communications had picked up chatter about eliminating the journalist's wife, evidence that Volkov's organization was actively planning to murder Elena to prevent her testimony. "Elena, we need to move you to an even more secure location," Agent Whitfield said after briefing Elena about the threats. "Volkov has resources that go far beyond what Victor could access. We're talking about professional assassins who specialize in eliminating federal witnesses." Elena was transferred to a maximum security federal facility that felt more like a prison than a safe house. She was allowed no contact with her family, no access to outside communication, and constant supervision by armed federal marshals. The isolation was psychological torture, but Elena understood that it was necessary to keep her alive. During her time in isolation, Elena worked with FBI investigators to reconstruct every detail of Victor's criminal activities that she had witnessed over the past 3 years. The information she provided helped the FBI understand how Volkov's organization had infiltrated legitimate businesses across the United States. Elena, your testimony is going to help us dismantle one of the largest criminal organizations we've ever investigated, Agent Whitfield told her during one of their sessions. But that also means that you'll need federal protection for the rest of your life. These people don't forget, and they don't forgive. Elena realized that her decision to survive Victor's murder attempt had condemned her to a life of permanent hiding. She would never be able to return to her old life, her old career, or her old relationships. The woman who had clawed her way out of a grave had saved her life, but lost her freedom forever. But Elena's investigation also revealed something that gave her hope for justice. David Chen's independent research had uncovered evidence that Victor's criminal activities extended back much further than anyone had realized. Victor hadn't just become corrupt recently. He had been building his criminal empire for over a decade. Elena, we found evidence that Victor may have been involved in the deaths of at least 3 other people who threatened to expose his activities. Chen told her during one of their secure video conferences. You weren't his first victim. You were just the first one who survived. Elena learned about Sarah Martinez, a former business partner who had died in a suspicious car accident after threatening to expose Victor's financial irregularities. There was Jennifer Walsh, an accountant who had discovered Victor's money laundering and had died from an apparent drug overdose, despite having no history of drug use. And there was Michael Torres, a journalist who had been investigating Victor's business practices and had disappeared while researching a story about organized crime infiltration of tech companies. Victor's been eliminating threats to his operation for years, Chen explained. The FBI just never connected the deaths because they were spread across different jurisdictions and made to look like accidents or suicides. Elena realized that she had survived not just an attempted murder, but an encounter with a serial killer who had been operating with impunity for years. The man she had married was not just a corrupt businessman, he was a professional murderer who eliminated anyone who threatened his criminal enterprise. But Elena's investigation also revealed the scope of the corruption that had protected Victor for so long. Judge Morrison wasn't the only judicial official who had been compromised. Victor's organization had been systematically bribing judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials to ensure that investigations into their activities were derailed or dismissed. Elena, we're dealing with a level of corruption that goes to the very top of the legal system in several states, Agent Whitfield explained. Your case has helped us identify dozens of officials who have been taking money to protect criminal organizations. Elena understood that her testimony would not just convict Victor and his immediate associates, but would expose a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government and law enforcement. She was no longer just a domestic violence survivor. She was a key witness in what would become one of the largest corruption cases in American history. As Elena's 8th month of pregnancy approached, she prepared for the trial that would determine not just Victor's fate, but the fate of an entire criminal organization. The woman who had been buried alive was about to help bury the criminals who had nearly destroyed her. But Elena also knew that testifying against such powerful and dangerous people would mark her for life. Win or lose, she would never be truly safe again. The price of survival and justice was a lifetime of looking over her shoulder, wondering if today would be the day that Victor's associates finally caught up with her. Elena had escaped from one grave, but in some ways she was still buried under the weight of secrets and the burden of knowledge that made her a permanent target for some of the most dangerous people in the world. The woman who had shocked the world with her escape was about to shock it again with revelations that would topple governments and destroy criminal empires. But first, she had to survive long enough to tell her story. How far would you go to silence a witness who could destroy your entire criminal empire? Elena was about to discover that when billions of dollars and hundreds of lives are at stake, there are no limits to the violence that desperate criminals will employ. Elena's ninth month of pregnancy coincided with the most dangerous period of her federal protection. Intelligence gathered by the FBI indicated that Volkov's organization had identified the general area where Elena was being held, and they were systematically working to locate and eliminate her before she could testify. Elena, we've intercepted communications that suggest they're planning a coordinated assault on our facility, Agent Whitfield informed her during an emergency briefing. We need to move you again, and this time, we're going to a location that doesn't officially exist. Elena was transferred in the middle of the night to a black site facility that the FBI used for protecting the most high-value witnesses. The location was so classified that even Elena wasn't told where she was being held. All she knew was that she was underground, surrounded by armed guards, and completely cut off from the outside world. The isolation was becoming unbearable for Elena, who had spent months without meaningful human contact beyond her FBI handlers. The pregnancy that should have been a time of joy and anticipation had become a nightmare of fear and uncertainty. Elena found herself talking to her unborn child constantly, the only companion she was allowed to have. We're going to get through this, little one, Elena whispered to her belly. Mommy's going to make sure the bad people can't hurt us anymore. But Elena's isolation was broken by unexpected news from Agent Whitfield. The FBI had arrested Sophia Lang after intercepting her communications with Volkov's organization. Sophia had been serving as a liaison between Victor's jail cell and the criminal organization, coordinating the efforts to eliminate Elena and other witnesses. Sophia's decided to cooperate with us, Agent Whitfield told Elena. She's willing to testify against Victor and Volkov in exchange for a reduced sentence and relocation to witness protection. Elena felt a complex mix of emotions about Sophia's cooperation. The woman who had pushed Victor to murder Elena was now helping to bring him to justice, but only because she had been caught and faced life in prison herself. Sophia's testimony revealed details about the criminal organization that even Elena hadn't known. She described meetings where Volkov had specifically discussed the journalist problem and ordered Victor to eliminate Elena before she could become a threat to their operations. Volkov told Victor that the organization had ways of making people disappear that would never be traced back to them. Sophia testified during her debriefing. He said that Elena was a trained investigator who could uncover their entire operation if she ever became suspicious of Victor's activities. Elena learned that her murder had been planned not just for financial gain, but as a preventive measure to protect a criminal enterprise worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She hadn't just been an inconvenient wife. She had been identified as an existential threat to one of the largest criminal organizations in North America. But Sophia's cooperation also revealed that the threats to Elena were far from over. Volkov's organization had learned about Sophia's arrest and was accelerating their timeline for eliminating Elena and any other witnesses who could testify against them. They're planning something for the delivery, Sophia warned the FBI. Volkov said that when Elena goes to the hospital to give birth, that would be their best opportunity to eliminate her while making it look like a medical complication. Agent Whitfield immediately implemented additional security measures. But Elena realized that the birth of her child, which should have been the happiest moment of her life, was now the most dangerous. Volkov's organization was planning to murder her and her newborn baby in a hospital room, making it appear that Elena had died from chilblain.